Broadcasting live from the School of Athens, this is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. So on today's program, we're going to talk about developments in South and Southeast Asia between the years 600 and 1450 CE, otherwise known as the post-classical era. But before we do that, it's important for us to revisit our old friend, China. So even though China is technically a part of East Asia, since it was the most powerful hegemonic entity in the area, it's important to keep our eyes on them as developments occur. So last time we left the Chinese, they were experiencing their golden age and they were having a heavy influence on the various entities around them, particularly Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. So let's take a minute to talk about how China impacted all of these areas. Even though China did have a profound influence on all three of them, it's important to note that all three of them did try and carve out their own individual autonomy and independence. So let's take them one at a time. Japan, although it adopted Confucian and Buddhist ideals, and even though it applied these Confucian ideals to politics, and even though during its cultural high point known as the Heian period, where it copied much of Chinese culture and architecture and writing, the Japanese really developed quite differently, especially after the Tang dynasty fell. Instead of Japan being a centralized bureaucracy type of government like China was, it developed into feudalism, which is a small-scale local style of governing in which various large landowners have military personnel loyal to them, and it's really a system in which the emperor is rendered kind of useless. So even the daimyo, who were the large landowners, were the ones with the real power as opposed to the emperor. Now you should note that that's very different than what develops in China, because China is centralized and the emperor has a lot of power. So despite some similarities, there were significant differences. Same thing with Korea. Even though Korea was a tributary state that interacted more economically with China than Japan did, by nature of its proximity and the fact that there's a sea that separates Japan and China, the Koreans also had their own individual characteristics. So, despite emulating the Chinese in terms of culture and art and writing and government, Korea had a large landed aristocracy. And by this we mean that there was a large group of really wealthy landowners that really called all the shots. They called all the shots so much so, in fact, that the civil service exams, which the Koreans did adopt from the Chinese, were not meritocratic. Rather, they were put in place simply to reinforce the power of the landed aristocracy. So, whereas during the Tang and Song periods in China, where civil service exams were very meritocratic and you could be a peasant that rose up the ranks, that was not the case in Korea. And finally, in Vietnam, although they adopted much of the cultural and philosophical ideas that the Chinese had, including government ideas, Vietnam actually, I would argue, developed most differently, particularly because of their views on family and relations between men and women. So despite having some Confucian ideals make their way into Vietnam really held on to the idea that women held a higher status, and as a result, they rejected foot binding and other Chinese practices that created subservience of the women in the area. In addition to this, after the fall of the Tang and sort of the decentralization of China for a minute, Vietnam fought hard to overthrow Chinese invaders and carve out its own independence. So if we were able to draw a conclusion here, hopefully we would say something along the lines of, despite China having a profound impact on all three of these areas did try to carve out their own independence at the same time. Okay, so we can put China to rest for a second, and let's talk about developments that were occurring in and around the Indian Ocean. Now, if we're going to talk about South and Southeast Asia, we have to revisit our old friend trade. So to do that, I welcome in John Green to remind us why Indian Ocean trade is so effective and why it took off.
Marketplace isn't as famous as it should be. Let's go to the thought bubble. So if you live in China and you need some ivory to make the handle for a sword, you have to trade for it because elephants only live in India and Africa. One of the reasons that Indian Ocean trade took off is that there were a wide range of resources available and a wide range of import needs, from ivory to timber to books to grain. But the most important thing was the wind. The Indian Ocean is home to a set of very special winds called monsoons. You generally hear about monsoons in the context of rain in India, but rather than thinking of monsoons as the rain itself, think of them as the wind that brings a rainy season. The great thing about seasons is that they come regularly, and so do the monsoon winds. So if you were a sailor, you could count on the wind to bring you from Africa to India if you sailed between April and September, and one that would bring you back to Africa if you sailed between November and February. In fact, these winds were so predictable that early maritime travel guides often listed ideal times of departure down to the week and sometimes even the day. Predictable winds made trade a lot less risky. Like back in the day when the only power for ships were sails and oarsmen, your cargo might not arrive on time, or it might spoil, or you might die, all of which are bad for the health of global economic trade. But predictable winds meant lower risk, which meant cheaper trade, which meant more trade, which meant more people could have awesome sword handles. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Okay, there are a few more facets of Indian Ocean trade worth mentioning. First,
Okay, so as John Green points out to us, the thing that made Indian Ocean trade so effective was predominantly the monsoon winds. The monsoon winds we've covered before, so hopefully you're able to remember them, but they created a predictable route for ships to travel between the East African coast and South Asia and Southeast Asia. Now, the thing that allowed Indian Ocean trade to take off, as we say, is the fact that there was such a diversity in goods, because Africa provides its own unique goods, and South Asia provides its unique goods, and Southeast Asia the same thing. There was a lot of desire for stuff that you couldn't get in other places. So the thing that really captures that the best is the fact that Indian Ocean trade was mostly after one thing, and that would be spices. If you're South Asia, particularly Sri Lanka, there are several different spices available to you that are not available in the rest of the world. So things like cinnamon and pepper and cloves and nutmeg, all of this is fundamentally important to making food taste good, and so it was in high demand. And since the Indian Ocean sports the best array of spices, people were heavily involved in trade within it. Now, although the monsoon winds played a big role, there were other factors that contributed to the emergence of trade in this system and really the effectiveness of it. It was the fact that there was technological innovation, both in terms of ships being invented and tools being used to navigate through the seas. Some tools that were invented and introduced to the Indian Ocean during this time would have been the astrolabe, which was an Arabic invention that sort of helped sailors navigate using the stars, and then of course the magnetic compass, which came from China during its golden age under the Song. There was also significant developments in terms of ships, including the triangular lateen sail pictured here. The importance of this boat is that it can sail against the wind. Therefore, not only do you have a really effective monsoon wind, you can now sail with the wind at your front instead of only at your back. China also introduced special kinds of ships, particularly the dhow pictured here and the junk ship pictured here. But those weren't the only ships. There were other really important ones too. Okay, now even though trade sort of characterized much of, it was the most important development in the area, it sort of grew up alongside various political developments as well. So the last time we left South Asia, you might remember that they were experiencing a golden age under the Gupta during the classical period. It's important to note that South Asia in world history is relatively decentralized most of the time. There are only about 5 times in world history where the modern-day country of India is unified under one political entity. And the most recent that we've discussed was the Gupta. Well, the Gupta fell in around 600 CE, and as a result of that, chaos ensued. There was local squabbles, and people really couldn't figure out how to bring political entities together. As a result, you get a fractioning between the north and the south of India. As a result of this, the development of a particular kingdom known as the Chola in South India becomes characteristic of the time period. So the Chola kingdom develops in South India, and various small-scale local kingdoms develop in the north. Now you'll note from this map here that the Chola, being in South India, obviously had important proximity to the Indian Ocean. The Chola will be enemies in this presentation for reasons that we will talk about in a second. Now, what's happening in the north? Well, the north experiences one of the most fundamental developments of the time period, and that would be the invasion of Muslim political entities had eventually settled down in the northern part of South Asia. So these Muslim invasions were the result of the expanding Dar al-Islam, and eventually the political entity that emerges in the northern part of India is known as the Delhi Sultanate. Now, the Delhi Sultanate is important because, like we said, there are very few times when India is unified, and the Delhi Sultanate will be one of them. Now they were not particularly welcomed by Indians because, as you can imagine, Islam coming into a predominantly Hindu area is going to have its problems. But the most important thing that the Delhi Sultanate brings is the tax on non-Muslims. Now, when they invade and set up camp, people who are of Hindu background have to pay the Muslim tax known as the jizya, and as a result, they don't necessarily like it. Now, if we were to look at a map, you will see that early expansion of Islam, when it broke out of the Arabian Peninsula, obviously went west and eventually takes over most of Spain, but it also moves east, crosses the Indus River, and moves in to the northern part of India, pictured here. Now, the thing about Muslim communities is that they're very good at trading with one another. Since it's a unified community of believers, their economy really thrives and takes off because they're so willing to trade with one another. So merchant activity during this time period when the Delhi Sultanate is set up becomes very, very intense. And not only are they trading inland, but they get on the Indian Ocean as well, and as a result of that, you'll see Islam spread to new areas, particularly Southeast Asia and islands in that area, but also to East Africa. Now, note that there's one small part of India that's not Muslim because, as we said, the Chola kingdom was able to sort of hold off Muslim invaders for a long period of time. Now, I mentioned that when Islam comes to South Asia, it and Hinduism clash. Now, it's important to note that Hinduism, obviously, since they're relatively polytheistic and they have their own religious text and they have their own ways of creating a societal interaction with religion, Islam is very, very different to the people of South Asia. Now, the people of South Asia had their traditions that they had been living with for several years, indicated here by a Hindu temple. Obviously, they had their own culture, and they had their own temples, they had their own religious worship, and their own matter of structuring society. So the arrival of Islam is really going to change things. Now, we said before that Islam is monotheistic, therefore in that regard it's different. But since it's a proselytizing religion in which it tries to seek converts, it really had the potential to upset the Hindu majority in the area. Now, Muslim leaders figured out very quickly that trying to actively convert by forcing South Asians to follow Islam wasn't really that effective. So instead, what they did, they were patient and hoped to convert people by mere exposure to the religion. This was much more effective because there were several Hindus of low castes that liked the ideas of Islam, particularly its egalitarianism towards the poor. Buddhists also converted in high numbers during this time period because the unity that Islam brought was in stark contrast to the corruption and the fractionalism that Buddhism had been enduring during the early time of this period. Now, as a result, Islam does have some roots, and therefore in the northern part of India, you're going to see the emergence of some Muslims and some Hindus, and then as a result of this, you'll see cultural impacts, and so many of the buildings that will be built during and after this period will look like a synthesis between Hindu buildings and Muslim buildings. Not only that, but you see the interaction of religious ideas and the carving out of new ones in South Asia. So there's emergence of a Bhakti movement, which is sort of like a mystic form of Hinduism, which correlates nicely to Sufi Islam, which is a mystic form of Islam. Now, it was a bit more egalitarian. It didn't stress the caste system as much. It wanted a more worldly experience than the strict religion centered following that most Hindus had experienced during earlier periods. The emergence of these two mystic religious practices in the area led to a lot of poetry that tried to understand the world in which people lived. Now, even though Islam comes into the area and has its small impacts, social structures in South Asia actually turn out to be incredibly flexible. Therefore, Islam is not able to upset the traditional caste system. So castes still are a thing. In fact, many Muslims, due to their occupations, actually were swallowed up into their appropriate castes during the period. So while Islam did have a small impact, Hinduism and the caste system were so heavily entrenched in South Asia that little was done to upset it. So now let's take a field trip and move from South Asia to Southeast Asia. But before we do that, I have to introduce you to Srivijaya, this very important city that emerges in the Straits of Malacca, which is this body of water right here. Now, you'll know that this is a very, very important waterway because China, which is up here, has to sail through it if it is going to enter into the Indian Ocean. Therefore, this becomes an important choke point for trade, and whatever state controls this is going to be very powerful because it can tax ships that go through it and also benefit from the trade of all the goods. And Srivijaya emerges in the 600s to be that state. Now, one thing we've said about Srivijaya that you must know is that Mr. Olson loves it, and therefore it's beneficial for you to hold it in a very close to your heart, if I say. Now, even though Srivijaya was probably one of the most important political entities in the area that you've never heard of and had a maximum impact on trade, you're less likely to hear about it and more likely to hear about Angkor, which is a political entity that emerges in South Asia. It was also known as the Khmer Empire. Now, it's heavily influenced by the religions of the day. Srivijaya was mostly influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism, just like Angkor. So Angkor boasts one of the wonders of the world, Angkor Wat, which is this incredibly massive and intricate and beautiful Hindu temple. Now, you'll note that even though it's in Southeast Asia, it still is embracing Hindu architecture and Hindu religion. So it just goes to show you how efficiently ideas, in addition to goods, were moved along the Indian Ocean. Even though Hinduism is the first religion to move in the area, it's important to note that once Islam enters and has its very successful economic activity and sort of takes over the Indian Ocean trade, Muslims convert merchants throughout the area. Eventually, the Straits of Malacca will be taken over by Muslim traders, and it will become a Muslim entity. If I were to revisit the map one more time and show you how Islam spread, you will note that when it gets into the Indian Ocean, these powerful states along the Arabian Peninsula, along East Africa, and they trade with other entities in here and take their religion with them all the way over to modern-day Indonesia, which is why, of all nations in the world, Indonesia has the largest population of Muslims. Well, that's all the time we have for today. This is your Buddha, signing off.